There are places in this world that seem to exist just outside of ordinary time. Places where the wind arrives before the rain, where the forest holds its breath at dawn, where the light through the leaves looks like something the morning invented just for you. High up in the folds of the Nila Mountains, there's a small house with a green roof and silver railings worn soft by years of wind. Moss creeps up the stone steps, tiny ferns have claimed the windowsills, and every morning, before the mountain has fully woken up, a girl named Mira carries her books out to the balcony, sits down at the little wooden table, and begins to read. She is not reading to escape the world. She is reading to understand it. This is a story of 1 year on that balcony, a year of rain and roots, of birds crossing continents, and light crossing 100,000 years to reach a single pair of eyes, of soil that breathes, and stone that remembers, and a forest that is quietly, continuously, talking to itself underground. It is a story about nature. But more than that, it is a story about what happens when you learn to pay attention. Welcome to the mountain. The girl on the mountain balcony, a story of wind, rain, roots, and the world that breathes, a long-form educational story for learners and dreamers. Prologue, the house that listened. High up in the folds of the Nila Mountains, where the clouds came to rest every morning like tired travellers, there stood a small house with a green roof. It was not a grand house. The walls were pale yellow, worn soft by years of rain. The wooden railings of the balcony had turned silver from years of wind and sun. Moss crept up the stone steps like quiet green carpet, and in the corners of the windowsills, tiny ferns had claimed their own little kingdoms. No one knew exactly how old the house was. The villagers at the base of the mountain said it was built by a man who had loved the sky so much that he wanted to sleep closer to it. His granddaughter, and then her daughter, and then her daughter, after that, all stayed. Each woman who lived in that house seemed to grow a little quieter, a little more observant, as if the mountain had taught them something about patience. The girl who lived there now was named Mira. She was 14 years old. With dark hair she kept tied back with a piece of braided grass, and eyes the colour of wet bark after rain, deep brown and very still. She was not quiet because she was sad. She was quiet because she was always listening. Every morning, before the rest of the mountain had fully woken up, Mira would carry her worn leather satchel out to the balcony, set her books on the little wooden table, and begin to read. This is where our story begins. Chapter 1, The Language of Leaves. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October when the forest first spoke to Mira in a language she could understand. She had been reading about photosynthesis, the process by which plants use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air to make their own food, and she was finding it genuinely difficult to stay focused. Her textbook had a diagram, a green leaf with arrows pointing in and out, labelled CO2 in, O2 out, light absorbed, glucose produced. It looked very clean and very organised, which somehow made it feel less real. She put the book down and looked at the forest. The trees on the slope before her were enormous. The oldest ones had trunks wider than her arms could reach. Their canopies caught the morning light and broke it into pieces, dappled gold coins scattered across the undergrowth below. As the wind moved through, the leaves turned slightly. and for a moment each one flashed silver on its underside. Mira watched this for a long time. She thought, every single one of those leaves is doing it right now. Every leaf on every tree on this entire mountain slope is pulling carbon dioxide out of the invisible air around me, soaking up the light I'm also sitting in, and quietly, without any fuss, turning it into sugar to feed the tree, and in return, releasing oxygen into the air I am breathing. The forest breathes, and I breathe because of it. She opened her notebook and wrote that down, not because she needed to study it, but because it felt important to have a record of the moment she stopped seeing photosynthesis as a diagram and started seeing it as something the world was doing all around her, continuously, silently, and without her having asked. There is a word in Japanese, komorebi, which means the interplay of light and leaves, the dappled sunlight that filters through trees. There is no single English word for it. Some things are so specific and so beautiful that individual cultures have to invent language for them. Mira did not know this word yet. She would learn it later, but she felt the thing it described, and she drew a small sketch of the light pattern on the forest floor in the margin of her notebook. Below the balcony, the mountain dropped steeply for about 30 meters before leveling into a wide ridge where the older trees stood. Those trees, she had learned their names over years of looking and asking, were mostly oak, hornbeam, and wild cherry. In spring, the cherry trees turned the ridge into something that looked like pink clouds had come to rest on the mountain. In autumn, like now, the oak trees went amber and rust, while the hornbeam turned pale yellow, almost the color of old paper. Between the trees, if you looked carefully, you could see other things living. Bracket fungi jutted from the sides of older trunks in neat, orange shelves. Woodpeckers, she could hear one now, a rapid mechanical drumming, worked their way up the bark looking for insects. A stream ran somewhere below. She could not see it from here, but had walked to it many times. It was cold and very clear, and smooth stones lined its bed, green with algae. Everything, she had come to understand, was connected to everything else. The stream fed the trees fed the fungi broke down dead wood and returned nutrients to the soil held the roots held the mountain in place during heavy rain. The mountain created the conditions, the altitude, the temperature, the moisture that allow this particular combination of trees to exist here and nowhere else on Earth. She had read about this interconnection in her ecology textbook, and it had made sense in an academic way, but sitting on the balcony, watching the komorebi, she did not yet have the word, but she had the thing. She felt it rather than just knew it. That is a different kind of understanding. Chapter 2, What the Rain Knows. The rains came in late October with the seriousness of a long-planned visit. The first day, there was only the smell, a deep, earthy richness that arrived hours before the actual rain, carried by a shift in the wind. Mira had learned to recognize it. Petrichor, it was called, the scent produced when rain falls on dry earth. It came from a compound called geosmin, released by bacteria in the soil when the first drops disturb them. She had read about it in a chemistry module and had then gone outside and breathed it in very deliberately, thinking, this is bacteria. I am smelling microscopic life being disturbed by water falling from a cloud. It had made the smell more wonderful not less. By the second day, the rain was falling steadily. Mira sat on the balcony in her large yellow rain jacket, a jacket she had inherited from her grandmother, so old it was almost a family heirloom, with her books protected inside an oilskin pouch, and she watched the mountain receive the water. The way rain interacted with the forest was, she had come to believe, one of the most complicated and underappreciated systems in nature. When rain hits a forest, it does not simply fall to the ground. The first thing it encounters is the canopy, the layer of interlocking leaves and branches at the top of the trees. The canopy intercepts a significant portion of the rainfall. Some of it evaporates directly from the leaf surfaces back into the atmosphere, without ever reaching the ground. This is called interception loss. And in a dense forest, it can account for 30 to 40% of total rainfall. The forest, in other words, recycles a large part of the rain back into clouds. The water that makes it through the canopy runs down branches and trunks in small streams called stem flow, and drips from leaf tips called throughfall. By the time it reaches the forest floor, it has been filtered through layers of leaf litter, twigs, and humus. The soil absorbs it gradually, slowing its journey and preventing it from simply running off the slope and eroding the mountain. This was why Mira had learned deforested hillsides flooded so badly. Without the canopy to intercept rainfall, without roots to hold soil, without leaf litter to slow absorption, the rain hit bare earth and ran straight downhill, carrying topsoil with it. The same rainfall that a healthy forest handled quietly and efficiently became a destructive force on bare ground. She watched a large drop gather on the tip of a hornbeam leaf at the edge of the balcony, grow slowly heavier, hang for a long moment, and then fall. That single drop, she thought, had travelled from the ocean, evaporated from a surface thousands of kilometres away, carried by prevailing winds, condensed into cloud and fallen here. It would be absorbed by the soil, taken up by root hairs, transported through the xylem, the tree's internal plumbing, all the way up to the leaves, where some of it would be used in photosynthesis, and some would be transpired back into the air through tiny pores called stomata, rejoining the atmosphere, eventually condensing again somewhere else. The water cycle was not a diagram in a textbook. It was that drop on that leaf on that afternoon. A single large oak tree can transpire hundreds of litres of water on a warm summer day. An entire forest transpires enough to affect regional rainfall patterns. Trees, in this sense, do not just live in a climate. They help create it. That evening, when the rain had softened to a fine mist, Mira saw something she had never noticed before. A thin layer of fog, not the mountain fog she was used to, which rolled in from below, but something that rose from the forest itself. It hovered just above the canopy, a ghost of moisture. She watched it for almost an hour, as the last light turned the mist gold and then grey. She understood, from what she had read, that she was watching the forest breathe out, the collective transpiration of hundreds of thousands of leaves, exhaling water vapour into the cooling evening air. She found it one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Chapter 3: The Underground City. In November, Mira was studying soil science, and her teacher had made a remark in class that she could not stop thinking about. There are more living organisms in a handful of healthy soil, the teacher had said, than there are people on Earth. Mira had looked down at her hands. She thought about the path from the house to the balcony steps and the dark soil at the edge of the ridge where she sometimes sat. She thought about that soil differently now. A single gram of healthy forest soil, she read in her textbook that evening, could contain up to 1 billion bacteria. There were also fungi, archaea, ancient single-celled organisms that are a separate domain of life from bacteria. Nematodes, tiny roundworms, protozoa, single-celled organisms that eat bacteria, springtails, mites, earthworms, beetle larvae, and organisms so small they did not yet have names. The soil, she understood, was not dirt. It was a civilization, an underground city, layered and intricate, where every resident had a role. The bacteria broke down organic matter, dead leaves, fallen branches, dead animals, into simpler compounds that plants could absorb. Without bacteria, the forest floor would simply accumulate the bodies of everything that had ever died in it. Nothing would decompose. Nothing would cycle back. Everything would stop. The fungi were even more interesting to Mira. She had learned about mycorrhizal fungi, fungi that form partnerships with the roots of most plants on Earth. The word mycorrhiza came from Greek mykes, meaning fungus, and rhiza, meaning root. These fungi extended the reach of a plant's root system dramatically, by up to 100-fold in some cases, in exchange for sugars that the plant produced through photosynthesis. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. The plant got water and minerals it could not access alone. The fungi got food, but the relationship was more extraordinary than a simple trade. The mycorrhizal network did not just connect one plant to one fungus. It connected plants to each other. A single fungal network could link dozens or even hundreds of trees in a forest, allowing them to exchange not just water and nutrients, but chemical signals. When one tree was under attack by insects, it could send chemical warning signals through the network that caused neighboring trees to begin producing defensive compounds before the insects reached them. Scientists had called this the Wood Wide Web. Mira sat with this idea for a long time. The forest above her was not a collection of individual trees competing for light and resources. It was a community. The trees were in communication. The old trees, the largest ones with the widest canopies and the deepest roots, were particularly well-connected hubs in the network, nourishing seedlings and younger trees through fungal links. Some researchers called them mother trees. She looked at the enormous oak at the far edge of the ridge. It must have been 300 years old, its canopy spread wide, and its roots reached deep. It had been a sapling when this mountain had looked very different, when there were no roads at the base, no electric lights visible at night in the valley below. How many thousands of connections did that tree have? She wondered, running invisibly through the soil. How many younger trees had it helped feed? A tree can reduce the amount of sugar it sends to neighboring seedlings when light becomes limited. It adjusts its generosity based on conditions. Whether this constitutes something like decision-making is a question scientists are still carefully exploring. That afternoon, Mira did something she often did when an idea felt too large to hold inside. She went outside and walked barefoot on the ridge, feeling the cool soil between her toes, and thought about what was happening beneath her feet. The invisible city, the fungal threads, the quiet exchanges of carbon and water and signals, the vast, slow conversation of the forest. It did not make her feel small exactly. It made her feel included. Chapter 4, Migration Season. December came cold and clear, and with it came the birds. Migration was something Mira had always been aware of. She lived in a place where you could not ignore it. Every autumn, the skies above the mountain became busy with travellers passing through. Flocks of fieldfares and redwings, thrushes from Scandinavia, driven south by the cold. Formations of cranes moving in long, diagonal lines so high they were sometimes only visible as a faint sound, and raptors, hawks, and falcons using the ridge to catch thermal currents that lifted them higher without effort, carrying them south. But this year, for the first time, she was studying migration scientifically, and it changed everything about how she watched. Bird migration, she had learned, was one of the most extraordinary feats in the natural world. A bar-tailed godwit, a shorebird, had been tracked flying from Alaska to New Zealand. 11 days of continuous flight, over 11,000 kilometers, without stopping to eat, drink, or sleep. During the weeks before migration, it ate almost continuously until it had nearly doubled its body weight, storing fat as fuel. Then, over those 11 days, its organs, including its stomach and intestines, which were no longer needed, partially atrophied to reduce weight. While its heart and flight muscles remained strong, it was, from a physiological standpoint, almost impossible. How did birds navigate? This was the question that most fascinated Mira. The answer, she had discovered, was that they used several systems simultaneously, a kind of redundant, overlapping GPS that was far more sophisticated than anything humans had designed. They used the position of the sun, compensating for its movement across the sky using an internal clock. At night, they used star patterns. Young birds were born with an instinct to identify the center of stellar rotation, roughly the North Star, and orient their bodies relative to it. They used the Earth's magnetic field, sensing it through a mechanism not yet fully understood, possibly involving quantum effects in special proteins in their eyes. And they used landmarks, mountains, coastlines, rivers, which they learned and remembered over years. A bird navigating from Norway to sub-Saharan Africa was reading the sky, the stars, the magnetic field of the planet, and the shapes of the land simultaneously, continuously, while also managing the physical demands of sustained flight. Mira found herself watching the fieldfares that arrived in the ridgetop hawthorn trees with new respect. They came in large flocks, noisy and energetic, and stripped the red berries efficiently before moving on southward. They had flown from Scandinavia. They were, in a very real sense, visitors from another country, passing through on a journey she could barely comprehend. Some migrating birds navigate with such precision that they return not just to the same country or the same forest, but to the same tree, sometimes the same branch, year after year. Home for some creatures is not a vague idea. It is a specific place on Earth. One clear morning, Mira saw the cranes. She heard them first, a deep, resonant, bugling call that was quite unlike any other sound in the sky. Then she looked up and saw them, a formation of perhaps 60 birds, flying in a long diagonal line so high they were just specks. They were moving from northeast to southwest, on a bearing that had not changed in thousands of years of evolution. She watched them until she could no longer see them or hear them. She thought about what they were doing, crossing a continent, reading the Earth's invisible magnetic field, following a route encoded in their genes, bound for a wintering ground they had never seen, but somehow already knew. The mountain she sat on was just a waypoint, a brief reference point in a journey that spanned thousands of kilometers. She felt suddenly and strongly that the world was much larger and stranger and more full of life than she usually remembered. Chapter 5. The Long Memory of Stone. In January, studying for an earth sciences exam, Mira became preoccupied with time. The mountain she lived on was composed primarily of metamorphic rock that had been transformed by heat and pressure deep in the Earth's crust. Her textbook explained that these rocks had originally been sedimentary, layers of sand and mud deposited at the bottom of a sea that no longer existed, compressed over millions of years into stone. Then, during a period of mountain building, tectonic forces had pushed them deep underground, where the pressure and heat had rearranged their mineral structure without melting them, producing the folded, layered rocks she could see exposed in the cliffs on the north face. Her mountain, in other words, had once been a seabed. She went out to the balcony and looked at the north cliff with this knowledge. The layers she could see, grey and white bands tilted at an angle, were former horizontal seabed layers, now folded and uplifted by forces so vast and so slow that the human mind struggled to contain them. The rocks she sat on were approximately 400 million years old. She was 14. She tried to imagine 400 million years and found she could not. Not really. She could say the words, she could write the number, but she could not feel it the way she could feel an hour or a week. It was too far outside the scale on which her mind naturally operated. Her teacher, when she had mentioned this difficulty, had said, "That's perfectly normal. Human beings evolved to think about time on the scale of a human life, decades at most. Geological time is so much longer that it requires a kind of deliberate mental adjustment. The trick is not to try to feel it the way you feel ordinary time, just to hold it as knowledge and let that knowledge change how you see things." She thought about this now, looking at the cliff. These rocks had existed before there were forests, before there were insects, before there were fish, before there were complex animals of any kind. The oldest of these rocks had formed when the most complex life on Earth was colonial algae and soft-bodied creatures without bones or shells. The forest below her, the oak, the hornbeam, the wild cherry, the moss and ferns and fungi were all impossibly recent. The birds passing through were newcomers. The house she lived in, with its worn yellow walls and silver railings, was so new as to be almost theoretical from the perspective of the stone. And she herself, 14 years old, sitting on a balcony with a notebook, was a blink. But she was also the thing that could look at the rock and understand what it was. The universe, as far as anyone knew, had spent 400 million years producing something capable of recognizing a former seabed. That seemed to Mira like it might be significant. Carl Sagan wrote that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. He meant that the atoms in our bodies are ancient, forged in stars that died before our sun existed, and that in us those ancient atoms have become capable of curiosity. We are, in this sense, the universe looking back at itself and wondering. She went inside and got her hand lens, a small magnifying glass she used for looking at things closely, and walked down to the base of the cliff. She held the lens to the rock surface and looked. Up close, the metamorphic rock was extraordinary. The minerals had been rearranged into fine parallel bands, mica crystals, white and silver, laid down in sheets. Between them, darker minerals. Hornblende, she thought, or possibly biotite. The whole surface, at this scale, looked like something that had been carefully woven, which, in a sense, it had, just not by anyone's hands. She stayed at the cliff for a long time, moving the lens slowly across the surface, and she thought about slow forces, the tectonic plates grinding against each other over tens of millions of years, the gradual uplift of the mountain, the slow, patient work of rain and frost and root over millions more years, gradually breaking down the surface, releasing minerals into the soil, which had fed the trees. The mountain was not a fixed thing, it was a process, enormously slow but continuous. It was being built up and broken down simultaneously. And the forest, and the soil, and the rain, and the fungi, and the birds, and the bacteria were all part of the same enormous, slow, intricate process. She was part of it too, she supposed. Chapter 6. Winter Light. April, on the mountain, was the quietest month. The deciduous trees had shed their leaves months ago, and now stood bare and grey against the pale winter sky. The undergrowth had died back. The birds had moved on or settled into winter patterns. The resident species, the ones that stayed year-round, moved through the forest in small, loose flocks. Blue tits, great tits, tree creepers, a pair of nuthatches that Mira had watched for 3 years now, on the same section of oak trunk. The world had slowed down, but it had not stopped. In winter, Mira studied physics. She was working through a module on light, and she found, as she increasingly found with every subject she studied, that the moment she took the concepts outside, they came alive in a different way. The light on a winter morning on the mountain was unusual. Without the canopy to filter and break it, the light reached the forest floor directly. It came in at a low angle. The sun spent the winter close to the southern horizon, never rising very high, and this low angle meant the light travelled through more of the atmosphere before reaching her, which scattered the shorter blue wavelengths and let the longer red and orange wavelengths through. This was why winter mornings had that particular golden, slightly amber quality. The same physics that produced sunsets, Rayleigh scattering, was at work all morning and afternoon in winter, simply because the geometry of the earth and sun placed the sun lower in the sky. She thought about this as she watched the morning light travel across the ridge. The bare oak branches caught it and cast long, thin shadows. The mossy rocks at the base of the cliff glowed a warm greenish gold. The stream, which she could see now that the undergrowth was gone, caught the light and threw it back in brief, random flashes. Light, she had been studying, was one of the strangest things in the universe. It behaved under different experimental conditions as both a wave and a particle. It travelled at the same speed in a vacuum, regardless of the speed of the observer, a fact so counterintuitive that it had required Einstein to work out the implications, and those implications had restructured the way physics understood time, space, and energy. The photons reaching her face right now had been produced by nuclear fusion in the sun's core about 100,000 years ago. It took that long for energy to travel from the core to the sun's surface through the dense plasma, bouncing, absorbing, re-emitting, diffusing. Then, from the surface, they traveled the 150 million kilometers to Earth in 8 minutes and 20 seconds. 100,000 years from the core to the surface. 8 minutes from the surface to her face. She turned her face up to the winter sun and closed her eyes and felt its warmth. Those photons were ancient. They had been working their way through the sun since before modern humans existed, and now they were landing on her skin and warming it, and some of them were entering her eyes and triggering the photoreceptors in her retinas, allowing her to see. The light that she was seeing the world by, she thought, was older than her species. Chapter 7. The River's Story. In spring, the mountain woke up all at once. It happened in a week in March, when the temperature rose 4 degrees and stayed there. Overnight, the dormant forest became a construction site. The buds on the oak trees split open to reveal leaves the size of mouse ears, luminous yellow-green in the light. The wood anemones came up through last year's leaf litter, white and trembling. The hazel catkins, which had been waiting all winter, released their pollen in yellow clouds on the first warm wind, and the stream became a river. The snowmelt from the upper peak had been arriving since mid-February in small quantities, but now it came seriously. What had been a clear, gentle stream became something muscular and opaque, full of sediment from the thawed soil above, rushing through the lower forest with a sound that was present everywhere. A continuous low roar, like a conversation in another room. Mira had been studying hydrology, the science of water movement through landscapes, and the transformation of the stream gave her a living textbook. The stream's catchment area, the total land surface that drained water into it, covered the entire northeast face of the mountain. Every piece of rain or snow that fell on that face eventually found its way to this stream, whether through surface runoff or through infiltrating the soil and travelling as groundwater, or through direct precipitation into the stream channel itself. In winter, the catchment was covered in snow. The snow acted as a reservoir, storing water in frozen form and releasing it slowly as temperatures rose. This was one of the important services that mountain snowpacks provided to lower regions. They delayed the delivery of water. Without snowpack, the spring melt would arrive all at once as a flood, and the summer dry period would be even drier. With snowpack, the water arrived gradually, feeding streams through spring and into summer. But the snowpack on this mountain, she had read in a regional climate report, had been decreasing for decades. Warmer winters meant less snow and more rain, and the rain did not store the way snow did. It ran off immediately. The stream's behavior was changing. More violent peaks in wet periods, lower flows in dry ones. She sat above the swollen stream and watched it carry its load of sediment, pale clay and fine sand, downstream toward the valley. That sediment would eventually settle somewhere lower, on a floodplain or in a reservoir, or reach the sea. The stream was, in this sense, very slowly disassembling the mountain. Every flood carried a small piece of it downstream. Given enough time, millions of years, mountains were reduced to plains by the patient work of water. But the mountain was also, very slowly, being rebuilt. The same tectonic forces that had uplifted it in the past were still active, deep beneath the Earth's surface. The mountain was in a state of dynamic equilibrium between construction and erosion, and it was winning by a small margin, which was why it was still here. Nothing, she thought, was permanent in the way that felt permanent. The stream would erode the mountain would lose the forest if the climate shifted enough. The forest depended on rainfall that depended on distant ocean temperatures. The ocean temperatures were rising. Everything was connected to everything else, and everything was in motion, on timescales from a second to a billion years. It was not a frightening thought, exactly. It was a very large thought, and large thoughts required space. She made space for it. Chapter 8. What grows back. In April, studying ecology, Mira learned about succession. Ecological succession was the process by which an ecosystem developed over time after a disturbance. If a forest burned, or a glacier retreated, or a volcano deposited fresh lava, the land did not stay bare. Life returned, in a predictable sequence, each stage preparing the conditions for the next. The first arrivals were pioneer species, organisms that could tolerate harsh conditions, bare soil, intense sunlight, poor nutrition. Lichens were often first on bare rock, not plants, but a partnership between fungi and algae, or sometimes cyanobacteria. The fungus providing structure and the algae providing energy through photosynthesis. Lichens grew very slowly, but very persistently, and as they did, they chemically weathered the rock surface, beginning the process of soil formation. After lichens came mosses, which accumulated organic matter as they lived and died. After mosses came herbs and grasses, plants that tolerated full sun and needed only thin soil. After herbs and grasses came shrubs. After shrubs came pioneer trees, birch and alder and willow, fast-growing species that tolerated poor conditions and full sun. Under the canopy of pioneer trees, in the shade and improved soil conditions they created, the slower-growing, longer-lived trees of the climax forest, oak, beech, hornbeam, began to establish themselves. Over decades and centuries, the pioneer trees were shaded out by the taller, more competitive climax species. The ecosystem settled into a mature forest, stable and complex, until the next disturbance started the cycle again. This process, this capacity for recovery, for self-organization, for returning to complexity from simplicity, was one of the things Mira found most remarkable about life on Earth. Life did not just exist. It reorganized. It rebuilt. Given time and a substrate to work with, it returned. She thought about the clear-cut area she had seen on a hillside across the valley the previous summer. A large patch, perhaps 20 hectares, where the trees had been removed. It had looked devastated. Bare soil, eroding gullies, a few broken stumps. But even then, in that first summer, she had noticed the beginnings of recovery. Rosebay willowherb, a pioneer plant, one of the first to colonize disturbed ground, had already begun colonizing the edges. By now, a year later, she imagined the willowherb had spread. After a few years, birch seedlings would begin to establish. In 30 years, there would be a young birch forest. In 100 years, the oaks would be beginning to take over. The forest she lived in, the ancient trees on the ridge, it was not in its original state either. This land had been cleared many times in human history, for grazing, for charcoal, for timber. The old oaks themselves might have been coppiced, cut back repeatedly to produce small diameter timber, before that practice was abandoned and the trees were allowed to grow freely. What looked ancient and undisturbed was, in fact, the product of many cycles of disturbance and recovery. Nature's memory was long, and its patience was longer. There is a Japanese concept called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in impermanence, incompleteness, and imperfection. The cracked bark of an old tree, the asymmetry of a moss-covered stone, the way a forest floor is never perfectly neat. These are not flaws. They are evidence of time and process. They are, in their way, beautiful, precisely because they are not permanent. Mira thought about this, looking at the ridge oaks. Their bark was deeply furrowed, their branches twisted in the shapes they had grown toward light over centuries. No two were the same. Each one was a record of every storm it had endured, every drought, every year of good rain, every insect outbreak. The forest was not a picture, it was a process, and she was lucky enough to sit at the edge of it every morning and watch. Chapter 9, The Silence Between Things. May arrived warm and full of sound. The birds were all singing, the territorial declarations and mating calls of spring. Each species with its own pattern, each individual with its own slight variation on the species song. Dawn chorus was a daily event that once you paid attention to it, was impossible to ignore. The blackbirds began before full light, their rich, fluting phrases unrolling into the quiet dark. Then the song thrushes, the robins, the chaffinches, each adding their layer, until by full sunrise the ridge was a dense fabric of sound that she could never quite take apart into individual voices, only experience as a whole. She had been studying sound in physics, wavelength, frequency, amplitude, how sound traveled through different media, how the ear decoded compression waves in air into the experience of music and voice, and she had begun listening differently. Sound, she knew now, was pressure waves, alternating compressions and rarefactions of the medium it traveled through. In air, at room temperature, it traveled at about 343 meters per second. The pitch of a sound was determined by its frequency, the number of compressions per second. The blackbird's song was a series of rapid modulations of frequency, each one produced by the syrinx, the bird's vocal organ, not equivalent to the human larynx, but a different structure found only in birds, capable of producing two independent streams of sound simultaneously. The forest shaped sound as well. The dense canopy absorbed high frequencies more than low ones, giving sounds that traveled through deep forest a muffled, bass-heavy quality. Open areas let high frequencies carry farther. Birds in dense forest tended to have lower-pitched, less complex songs than birds in open habitats, because the physics of their environment selected for signals that carried better. The birds were singing in the shapes the physics allowed. She sat on the balcony in the early morning with her eyes closed and listened to the chorus and tried to hear each layer separately. The blackbird nearest her. Behind it, farther down the slope, another blackbird. the rapid mechanical song of a great tit, a sound she had always thought sounded like a small, insistent saw, the distant, two-note call of a cuckoo arriving from somewhere to the southeast. And between all of it, silence, not total silence. There was always the wind, the stream, the background of leaves. But there were spaces between the bird phrases, micro-pauses, and in those pauses she could feel the size of the forest, the depth of it, the way the sound lived inside all that space of tree and air and distance. Music, she had read, was as much about silence as about sound. Rhythm was the relationship between sound and silence. A melody was meaningful partly because of the spaces between the notes. Without silence, there was no music, only noise. The same was true of the forest sound. The silence between the bird calls was not emptiness. It was part of the structure. Chapter 10. Coming Home to the World. By the time summer arrived, Mira had filled 3 notebooks. They were thick books with cloth covers that she had bought at the beginning of the school year, and every page was dense with observations, questions, diagrams, copied passages from textbooks, drawings of leaves and fungi and birds, chemical formulas surrounded by her own annotations. The notebooks were not quite a scientific journal, and not quite a diary. There was something in between, a record of a year of looking at the world and trying to understand it. Her grades had improved significantly, her teachers noted, but that was not the main thing. The main thing was harder to describe. She had begun the year feeling, as she sometimes did, that studying was something separate from living, a task to be completed so that real life, whatever that was, could proceed. The balcony, the forest, the mountain had always been there, a backdrop. Her books had been in her hands. Somewhere over the course of the year, the separation had dissolved. The photosynthesis diagram was the leaves turning silver in the wind. The water cycle was the drop hanging from the hornbeam leaf. The mycorrhizal network was the soil beneath her bare feet. The migratory bird was the crane formation crossing the sky on a magnetic bearing. The metamorphic rock was the former seabed she could hold in her hands. Rayleigh scattering was the amber winter morning. Ecological succession was the forest she lived in, which had been cleared and regrown and cleared again, and was currently in a phase of recovery it had been working on for centuries. These were not 2 different things, the world and the knowledge of the world. They were the same thing, seen from different distances. On the last morning of June, Mira woke before dawn. She made tea, a habit she had developed over the winter, sitting in the dark kitchen while the water boiled, and carried it out to the balcony. The sky was deep blue-black in the west and grey-pink in the east. The first birds were beginning, a single blackbird, somewhere on the ridge, singing in the dark. The air was cool and smelled of damp grass and the particular sweetness of the wild roses that had begun to open along the path to the cliff. She sat with her tea and watched the sky lighten. Jupiter was still visible, a steady bright point near the western horizon, not twinkling the way stars did. Planets didn't twinkle, she had learned, because they were close enough for their disks to be marginally resolvable, which averaged out the atmospheric distortion that caused twinkling in the point sources of stars. Jupiter was 600 million kilometers away. The light she was seeing from it was about 30 minutes old. The morning star brightened and then faded as the sky shifted from deep blue to grey to pale gold. The forest below her went from a single dark shape to a layered landscape of individual trees. The stream, which she had not heard in the warm, still night, began to be audible again as the dawn air carried sound differently. The blackbird was joined by a song thrush, then a robin, then the thin, reedy song of a warbler that had arrived, she calculated, from sub-Saharan Africa about 3 weeks ago, following a navigational system of stars and magnetic fields. A mist was rising from the canopy below, the forest breathing out its overnight moisture as the air warmed, the same thing she had watched on that rainy October evening, almost 9 months ago now. She opened her notebook. She wrote, June 30th, dawn chorus beginning. Jupiter visible, setting west, mist off canopy. Warbler in the hornbeam below the ridge. This exact morning will not happen again. She paused and then wrote, but the things that made it are permanent in their own way. The physics doesn't change. The water cycle doesn't change. The bird will return next April from the same winter territory it has used for years. The mountain will still be here, being built and eroded long after everything I know about it is forgotten. She thought about that. Then she wrote, I think being a student of the world means learning to hold two things at once. The knowledge, which is general and permanent, and the moment, which is specific and passing. Both are real. Both matter. The sun cleared the horizon, and the light changed from gold to white, and the mist began to dissipate, and the full chorus was going now. All layers at once, the wave and particle of it, the compression and the silence, the whole complicated, alive, present tense world. Mira sat in the middle of it with her tea and her notebook and watched,